I'm a skeptical historian, and since the day I arrived here in Colorado Springs, all you hear about, you cannot avoid Palmer. Palmer is everywhere. His sculpture, the high school, the park, all of that stuff is Palmer. And, you know, as a skeptical historian, I have wanted to find dirt on that guy from day one. And it's really just not there. I think he is a remarkable citizen. I think there are still things that we're going to find out about him, which will only serve to add to his reputation.
I think she felt that William Palmer was definitely a historical figure. I think she recognized his place in history, and I think she was very intent upon saving everything that he wrote to her to be passed down. On the other hand, he was very busy. He was traveling. He was also a very private man. He never allowed anything to be written much about him in Colorado Springs during his lifetime.
Palmer's unique genius was his ability to say there ought to be a railroad, and then to find people who would build the railroad for him. To say there ought to be a beautiful resort-like city at Colorado Springs that will attract the finest colleges and the best newspapers, and then find people who would go and do that. Same was true with Colorado College. General Palmer did not found Colorado College, but he gave the land for the college and found the people who made the college go. So that was his great talent, to have wonderful ideas, but rather than tying up his life and time carrying them out, he found other people to do it for him.
One of his daughter's best memories of a day-long hike with her father in the Colorado hills, and how they laid in the grass and they told stories and they sang songs. He encouraged his daughter's imagination and appreciation of nature. And that's a side of Palmer that most people don't know about. We have charming pictures of him wearing a Mexican sombrero and playing amongst the rocks and in the grass with his daughters, you know, playing a dress-up game with them, and really being lighthearted and casual with his daughters. And we know that he felt very strongly for them, and they felt very strongly for him as well.
It was after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The fighting was still going on, and Palmer, I believe at that time, was on his pursuit of Jefferson Davis. Came riding into a small village, and a young lad of about 15 years old had hidden in the underbrush, took a shot at him. If that shot had if his aim had been accurate, we would have never had the General Palmer, or William Jackson Palmer story of the Western development, because his life would have ended there. And in fact, I guess it was very close to where he wasn't wounded, but the bullet came very close to him. His men captured the young boy, and rather than doing anything drastic, Palmer sought out the boy's mother, released him to her, and told him to keep a better watch on her child. That shows you just what kind of a guy he was.
William Palmer came into the world on September 17, 1836, at Kinsale Farm in Kent County, Delaware. His father, John Palmer, was a country schoolmaster until he met and married Matilda Jackson and moved to Kinsale Farm to raise their family. Young Will was 5 when his parents relocated to the Germantown area of Philadelphia, where he would spend his boyhood.
Both his parents were Quakers, from what we know, fairly strict Quakers, and they brought up their children to believe in the Quaker faith. For the most part, to abstain from alcohol, to be responsible, to be dutiful. Palmer had 2 brothers, Charles and Frank, and a sister, Ellen. Palmer's ancestors were known to be English, Dutch, and it is believed that his ancestors came over to America with Penn. They were Quakers. They belonged to a branch of Quakers known as the Hicksites. In 1828, there was a schism in the Quaker Church, and there were 2 branches, the Evangelicals and the Hicksites. Palmer and his family belonged to the Hicksite branch, which essentially means that they were a branch of Quakers that believed more fully in the inner light, the conscience, as your guiding light. From what we know, again, our knowledge of his early years is really limited, but he was a very bright child, precocious, and very well educated. He attended the Friends School, the Zane Street Grammar School, and was the youngest student in his class at the Boys High School in Philadelphia. From an early age, he expressed an interest in engineering, in railroading, in science. When he was 17, he went into the engineering corps for the Hempfield Railroad, and that was where he gained his first professional employment experience, and he worked for a man named Charles Ellett, who was a terrific engineer and a great influence on William Jackson Palmer. He worked from 1853 to 1855 for the Hempfield Railroad, and then in 1855, he traveled to England and to Scotland and to Wales and to Ireland and to eventually to France as well. And he was studying coal mining, railroad engineering. He was studying the use of anthracite coal to power railroad engines. He was writing articles for the Pottsville Miners Journal, which he was being paid to do, and not only were his articles appearing in this Miners Journal, but they were also appearing in papers throughout England. His work was really becoming well known as a railroad engineer. Another great influence in his life was J. Edgar Thompson. And J. Edgar Thompson had risen from chief engineer of the Pennsylvania Railway to the presidency of the Pennsylvania Railway. And he met Palmer while Palmer was traveling throughout England in 1855. And J. Edgar Thompson was abroad trying to raise additional financing for his railroad, extra investors. They met, and Thompson was immediately impressed with Palmer and all of his research. So after Palmer arrived back home in the spring of 1855, he first went to work for the Westmoreland Coal Company, and then soon thereafter was hired by J. Edgar Thompson as his private secretary on the Pennsylvania Railway. It was an exciting era. This was the era of the railways. When Palmer was growing up in Philadelphia in the 1830s, 40s, and early 50s, Philadelphia was the largest city in the United States. It was exciting. It was a port. It was industrious. There was the new growth of railways and industry was really, a lot was centered there in Philadelphia. So he was a man of his time, and by knowing brilliant engineers like Charles Ellett and then becoming closely acquainted with J. Edgar Thompson and other people like Andrew Carnegie, he was very well connected in that era and had all of the tools at his disposal to embark on his railroad career. When the Civil War broke out in the spring of 1861, Palmer really did a lot of deep thinking and questioning what he would do. At that time in 1861, his inner light was so strongly speaking out that he needed to join that overcame his opposition to war. And as you know, Quakers are pacifists in nature. He did not like war. He thought an unjust war was legalized murder. So he weighed those two very different evils, war versus slavery, and he felt moved to join the Union cause.
With his strong abolitionist sympathies, The young businessman convinced like-minded friends and acquaintances to enlist with him and form the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry.
He raised what was called the Anderson Troop earlier on. That was the first body of men he raised. They were to be the bodyguard for General Anderson, who was at that time General of the Army of the Ohio. General Anderson was fairly famous himself. He was the major who surrendered Fort Sumter to the Confederates. And that's where the name the Anderson Troop came from. The troop that Palmer raised and became captain of went on to serve under General Sherman and General Buell, both of who preceded General Anderson in command of the Army of the Ohio. In fact, the Anderson Troop was meant to be a bodyguard for the general and his battlefield couriers and scouts and that type of thing. So his regiment was raised intact from volunteers. In fact, he had, I believe, close to 3 times the number of volunteers he needed to raise the 1,200 men for his regiment. They went into Carlisle Barracks, the regiment did, for its training. While they were there, Lee had invaded Maryland, and that's the time of the Battle of Antietam, which was the bloodiest battle the Union was ever in, period, at any time in its history. And the general, at that time just a colonel, decided that they needed information behind the enemy lines, and he decided to become a spy and go after this information. He would change into civilian clothes, enter behind enemy lines. In one case, he stayed with a farmer whose farmyard became a camp for the Confederate forces, and he got to dine with the Confederate officers, questioned them on their plans for the coming days, and got all of that information. That night, the farmer sneaked him out through his cornfield and in back to the Union lines, and he was able to telegraph that information to General McClellan, who was the general in command at the time of Antietam. He did that a number of times. At one time, he entered the Confederate general's camp as a civilian, made himself acquainted with the younger officers, messed with them in their mess tent, talked to them about their battle plans, and returned through the lines and again telegraphed that information to General McClellan's headquarters. He seemed to enjoy this flirting with death. If he had been caught, he would have been hanged on the spot because he was going in as a spy, dressed in civilian clothes. Palmer posed as a mining engineer who had mine properties in that area, and he was there to take a look at his mine properties, and from his engineering background, he was able to pretty much be convincing on that score.
Colonel Palmer was eventually captured and imprisoned at the notorious Castle Thunder in Richmond, Virginia, but a bureaucratic error rescued him from the gallows. After several months, he was released in a prisoner exchange.
He went into the war expecting not to come out alive. The carnage was such that a tremendous number of the officers were killed. He thoroughly expected to not come out of the war alive. He expected to be killed. So he just made up his mind that if it looked like he would be captured, he would just make a last-ditch fight and go down fighting. He wouldn't be captured. His regiment operated as an independent command throughout the war. It was not assigned to any one particular army unit. It was kind of a roving command. He was subject to the orders of the commanding general in the field and to the War Department at Washington, D.C. But other than that, he was given pretty much a free hand to do what he liked to do. And what he liked to do was to go into enemy territory behind enemy lines and scout out enemy forces, ride through enemy territory. He made a number of really historic rides. Took his command on one ride. They covered 1,000 miles behind enemy lines in 70 days, which is really traveling if you've got a cavalry force. He was also known for the fact that his unit suffered lighter casualties, probably overall, than most other units engaged in the war. He was very careful of his men. He didn't throw them away as cannon fodder. He was heart-stricken whenever any man under his command was killed, and he did his best to avoid that. He didn't avoid fighting. He led them into fights, charging at the head of them through shot and shell, but he was careful not to throw them against entrenched forces where it was this kind of a hopeless, this for the glory of it. And he always, in fights like that, he always led his men. He never ordered them forward. He went out and led them. So he was really quite a soldier.
By the end of the war, Colonel Palmer had become a brevet brigadier general, an honorary rank he would maintain the rest of his life. In 1894, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his gallantry in action at Red Hill, Alabama on January 14, 1865, attacking and defeating a superior force of the enemy, capturing their field piece and 100 Confederates without losing a single man.
At the end of the Civil War, I think General Palmer looked around the country, saw that the opportunity in railroad building was going to be west of the Mississippi rather than east of it, and thus chose to associate himself with two things. Number one, the surveying of prospective rail routes across the western United States, and then the actual construction, supervising the actual construction of the Kansas Pacific Railroad from Kansas City to Denver, Colorado.
Palmer finished construction of his first rail link to Denver in the record time of 1 year, despite Indian raids upon his Mexican work crews. Palmer's solution for what he termed the Indian problem was no more advanced than his contemporaries, namely, to fight them vigorously and civilize them later. During this time, Palmer frequently traveled back east to confer with railroad management and investors. On one trip, he had a fortunate encounter with a prominent New York lawyer, William Proctor Mellon.
Palmer happened to be in the club car and made the acquaintance of Mr. Mellon, and they were discussing what Palmer's intentions were of pursuing the railroad, and Mellon was very, very interested. At that point, in comes 19-year-old Queen, and within moments, I think it was, Palmer decided he was in love with this young woman. She was only 19, he was 32. She was petite, dark-haired, very vivacious. She had this unruly curly hair that she was constantly trying to calm down and train into the modern styles of the day. But he immediately knew that she was the one that he wanted to spend his life with. She was very intelligent. She could carry on a wonderful conversation. They just immediately hit it off, and there was undoubtedly a chemistry between them. Meeting Queen was very exciting, and the courtship started immediately after that. Within just a matter of weeks, they were engaged. She returned to Flushing, New York, and he frequently was able to visit her there. And they had a fun courtship. They found that they had a lot of things in common. He had such a curious mind, and she did too. She was very well educated. She loved architecture. She loved plays, writing, long discussions. They went to a number of things that they could enjoy together when he was in Flushing, New York. They were married in November of 1870, and they immediately left on a ship to go to England. It was an extended honeymoon of 3 months, and they did a lot of wonderful social events, but mixed in that was Palmer's efforts to talk to many of the financiers that he needed to back him on the Colorado Springs Company, which was the company that formed the town of Colorado Springs. So they were feted in a number of social events, dances, dinner parties, but then he would need to take off for several days, sometimes to Belgium. He would leave her there with friends that they were staying with, or sometimes in a hotel, and she found it necessary to just amuse herself and stay busy, and it was almost like a rehearsal of what their married life was going to be like, because although his family was extremely important to him, he had this driving desire to complete his other ambitions, and so she frequently was left on her own.
One of his first encounters, and certainly one of the most documented encounter with the Pikes Peak region, came while Palmer was still working for the Kansas and Pacific Railroad in, I believe, 1869. He was in a stagecoach driving from Pueblo to Denver. Made a stop in Colorado City to have breakfast. He bathed in Fountain Creek and had breakfast near Garden of the Gods. And he wrote to his letter, a letter that we have here, wrote a letter to his then fiancée, Queen Mellon, saying that near here is the most enticing scenery, and there's great water in the area, and that he was sure that there would be a famous resort here soon after the railroad reaches Denver. And so it kind of really is the precursor. It preordains the formation of Colorado Springs. So it's really exciting to kind of you hold that letter and you read that letter and you feel like you're there at the creation. And so that's really what that is. And again, that has everything to do with his employment with the Kansas and Pacific Railroad. I would say that the way I interpret the creation of Fountain Colony is that it was modeled after a number of colonies. I know that he was aware of what was going on in Greeley, but he was also following other colonies that were being developed. And colonies were very common after the Civil War in the American West as kind of an idealistic community-building venture. There was a German colony under development in the wet mountains of Colorado that he spoke about. And so I don't know that, I think it's fair to say that Greeley was not the sole inspiration, but certainly he was looking at what other colonies were doing and trying to pick and choose those elements that he thought would make for the best community for him and for this place. He stole away some of the key employees from Union Colony. It's kind of like a sports team today trying to steal the talent of another sports team. Brought them down to create his own city, and certainly they brought some of those influences with them, the idea of strict temperance policies and good irrigation and things like that. So he kind of used, there are two sets of distinct types of people that he used to create this town. One were those people who had experience creating other colonies, other utopian settlements, and the other were his Civil War buddies. And so those seem to be the two strongest influences that he had in the creation of this community. And then there's this blending with people who had money, Eastern money, and people who had an interest in the community, just for that reason, that there was potential for profits to be had in Western city building.
Palmer promoted his future railroad and dream city to anyone who would listen, especially to his young bride, accustomed to the sophistications of New York and Europe. He finally persuaded her to join him while their home was being constructed west of his city at Glen Erie.
Their home had been started in Glen Erie, but it was not completed, and he wanted to kind of prepare the way for her. So he left her with her family in Flushing, New York, and that would have been from February of 1871 until about October. And in October, she, her father, her stepmother, and her 6 stepbrothers and stepsisters, came all the way on by train, because by that time the train came down through Colorado Springs, and they came down and arrived in October. She was, of course, thrilled to be coming back to her handsome cavalry husband.
There wasn't much here at that time. They had put up a log cabin right down where the present train station is, and that was the focus. There was a restaurant in the train station, and I'm sure there were a couple of houses being started downtown, and but it was September 1871 before they actually started this building out here. And while it was in construction, Queen lived in a tent first downtown, and a general with her. And then she moved up to Denver because the general had brought his own mother out to Denver and bought her a house up there so she could be near him. His father had passed away during the war. And then closer to the time of the finishing of the building, she came back down. They lived upstairs in the stable, and that wasn't quite as nice as it was living in Denver, because one story is that through the night the rodents were running across them as they slept on the floor of the stable. Queen wasn't very appreciative of that.
She tried to make the best of it. She formed social clubs. She taught school. She opened up the earliest school here in Colorado Springs. She put together performances of theater and opera. And she was very adept at making friends. She was a very social person, and she was a fun-loving person. And quite a few years younger than Palmer, she was very young at heart. She loved literature. She loved music. She loved dancing. In 1872, their daughter Elsie was born, their eldest daughter. Unfortunately, in 1880, while traveling to Leadville with her good friend Alma Strettle, Queen Palmer suffered the first of her several heart attacks. After her heart attack in 1880 near Leadville, doctors urged her to find a lower altitude, so she moved to New York City. They had an apartment. The Palmers had an apartment on 72nd Avenue at the Dakota. She gave birth to her daughter Dorothy in New York City and lived there for approximately 2 years. But unfortunately, New York didn't suit her health as well, and her doctors urged her to find a wetter climate of low altitude, and they encouraged her to move to England, where she moved permanently in 1882, and that's where their youngest daughter Marjorie was born. Now we know, even though they lived apart for the rest of their marriage, they traveled frequently back and forth. Queen traveled a few times to Glen Erie with their daughters, but Palmer traveled at least twice a year by ship to England, and his visits there were greatly anticipated. We have the girls' diaries and commonplace books where they describe their father's arrival, and when he would come they would have parties and they would travel together. He kept and maintained a very close relationship with his family. In fact, we know that even when he was away from them, he wrote these touching letters to Queen that described how he hoped his daughters would be raised in his absence. And he wanted his girls to get out and exercise. He wanted them to have music and art and literature, and not to apply themselves too hard to their books because he felt it would endanger their health. He also was a very typical father. He was involved in all facets of their life, their diet, their exercise, and their allowance. He also urged her to avoid coffee, tea, or stimulants, and to get to bed early by 10 p.m., except when parties, operas, dinners got in the way.
He was very involved and very interested in their health. Her plan was to come back to Glen Erie just as soon as she possibly could. And there is one letter to him, actually it was a draft of a letter, that I think is the most telling of their relationship during that time. They truly ached for each other. And she begged him in this letter to give up some of his work in Colorado Springs and come there and be a family again. And she said that if, that meant that there was not enough money, that she would happily move to a smaller place and get it ready for him so that he could join his family. But I'm sure that General Palmer just felt that he couldn't abandon his dream child of Colorado Springs, and so he tried to incorporate the two.
While visiting his family in England, Palmer contacted his European investors, who were introduced to him by his close friend and business associate, Dr. William Bell. William Alexander Bell was a wealthy British adventurer who had been Palmer's chief photographer while building the Kansas Pacific Railroad. Bell was developing the Manitou Springs Resort at the foot of Pikes Peak, which would serve the Little Londoners of Palmer's Fountain Colony. Upon his return from abroad, Palmer wasted no time getting back to work. Each day he rode the 5 miles across the mesa from Glen Erie to his office in town. His new city and railroad now commanded his undivided attention.
General Palmer was truly a railroad builder. You didn't find General Palmer out supervising the actual construction of the rail line. His role in the railroad industry was conceiving railroads, taking care of the politics required to get right-of-ways, and above all, his great ability seemed to have been to raise money. And he seemed to be particularly close to a group of British investors who he could turn to, and who he did turn to finance the construction of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. General Palmer's original intention was to build south toward the Rio Grande Valley, and that's why the railroad is named the Denver and Rio Grande. But it was deflected away by two things. Number one was the Santa Fe Railroad grabbed the most logical pass from Colorado into New Mexico. That's Raton Pass, which is now occupied by the Santa Fe Railroad. Today it's the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad. Cut off from that route, General Palmer built westward through the Royal Gorge, and that right-of-way also was contested with the Santa Fe, but in this case the Rio Grande Railroad got the right-of-way through the Royal Gorge. And that's what caused General Palmer to mainly build narrow-gauge rail lines in western Colorado rather than down in the Rio Grande Valley. Now, he did build a line over La Vida Pass down into Alamosa, and from there the line went south into New Mexico. But that's as far as it ever got. The Rio Grande Railroad became much more important for its lines in Colorado, lines which went to silver and gold mining camps, and eventually the line went from Pueblo to Salt Lake City. Naturally, in the time period we're talking about, the late 19th century, with the railroads being the top transportation technology, the building of a railroad into a community had a tremendous impact on the economy there, particularly on people who own land close to where the railroad came through town, because the railroad station very quickly became an important center of activity, and land around the railroad station would greatly appreciate in value. Now, General Palmer didn't see why, when he was the person building the railroad, someone else should benefit from the high land prices around the railroad station. So instead of building his railroad into existing towns, General Palmer would usually build his railroad to a spot 2 or 3 miles away where he owned all the land, put the station up there, create a new town, and then he would make all the money from the economic impact of the railroad. Two examples of this: one is Conejos, an established city down in southern Colorado. General Palmer didn't build his railroad into Conejos, he built it into Antonito, a new city which he founded close by. Another example is Colorado City, one of the oldest cities in Colorado, located at the foot of Pikes Peak, adjacent to the Garden of the Gods. General Palmer bought all the land, established a new city, Colorado Springs, and built the main line of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad through Colorado Springs, rather than Colorado City. Again, that way he got all the economic benefit from the railroad. As you might expect, that policy enriched Palmer, but did make him quite unpopular with landowners in established cities in Colorado. General Palmer filled the state with a virtual web of narrow-gauge railroads. By the time the Rio Grande Railroad had reached its peak, it had 3 major east-west rail routes across Colorado. One along the New Mexico border that went through Antonito over Cumbres Pass to Farmington, New Mexico. Then there was another route through Salida that went over Marshall Pass and down through Gunnison and the Black Canyon of the Gunnison to Grand Junction. Then a third route that went up to Leadville, over Tennessee Pass, down the Colorado River through Glenwood Springs to Grand Junction. So literally, General Palmer, with his narrow-gauge railroad, developed the state of Colorado and created this giant web of narrow-gauge railroads. It's wrong to think of the Denver and Rio Grande as just hauling mining machinery into the mining camps and gold and silver ore out of the mining camps. The railroad also developed a tourist passenger trade that was quite substantial. You could ride a circle trip around Colorado. You could leave Denver and circle through the mountains and then come back by a different route. The Rio Grande had comfortable coaches and Pullman cars. People came from all over the United States and Europe to ride what was called the scenic line of the world. And the Rio Grande was one of the Western railroads that pioneered this kind of tourist development. And in the course of doing it, they not only promoted the railroad, but they promoted the whole state of Colorado.
In 1901, Palmer sold off his interest in the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railway. And he traveled by his private railway car with his daughter, Elsie Palmer. They traveled in the Nomad. They traveled west across the mountains to Utah, all along the western route. And on that trip, he dispersed $1 million to various railway employees because he had, when he sold off the railway, he earned an additional $1 million that he hadn't planned on. And he felt that he needed to share that with his workers. And so a ticket agent in Salt Lake City received a check. Various engineers and section crewmen received checks for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And to their surprise, they shared in his profits of the sale of his railway.
Palmer's railroad career also included his pioneering efforts toward developing the Mexican National Railway. To this day, he is considered a national hero in the Republic of Mexico.
Obviously, the example that he had here in the Pikes Peak region when he arrived was Colorado City. And that was not the kind of community he wanted to create. And in fact, we think he intentionally bypassed Colorado City with the railroad to send a message, not only so he could create a community, but to send a message that Colorado City and the place it was with drinking and gambling and houses of ill repute were not the future. The future was places like Colorado Springs with its temperance laws and deed restrictions in the land that you purchased. And so obviously he'd spent enough time in the West to see things that he did not want to model. He was modeling Greeley and other places, but he probably was negatively influenced by as much of the West as he was positively influenced. So that's a good example of what Palmer's vision is to look at what Colorado Springs was not. I mean, there you go. You have the two forms of the Western town. Palmer really just wanted to create a beautiful, healthful city that would attract people to it. And so in that case, it's much different than many of the Western colonies. What his vision was, it's always troubling for me to try to define what his vision was, because we don't specifically know, but you can take a few of the elements that Colorado Springs has and certainly draw some conclusions. During the Palmer years, and even after that, never really had an industry. The industry of Colorado Springs was the people that either came to visit or came to live, and making sure that they enjoyed their life. And so you had things like merchants. You had a lot of service economy. Still, really, what marks Colorado Springs today is a lot of service industry, as opposed to the dirty industries, the smokestack industries of the East. And so that's one of them. Pueblo was his steel-making town. Colorado Springs was the town where people just went to enjoy life. You could get here easily, you could get out of here easily, and there wasn't a lot of smoke belching into the air from any kind of industry. So that's one element of his vision. The other elements are what kind of an environment would you live in, and you can look and see. The El Paso Canal was created to water Colorado Springs, not to water crops as you would have had in Greeley, but to water trees and grass and flowers. And so you could see by doing that he wanted to create a green community on what had been a short grass prairie with very little vegetation. The wide streets obviously made a statement of prosperity and prominence, and was in marked contrast to the place where he grew up, where the streets were so narrow, even in marked contrast to Colorado City, just a couple miles west of here, where the streets are very narrow, and the streets were solely utilitarian. It allowed you to get from point A to point B. Colorado Springs were not that. They were well laid out and very broad, and were meant to send both residents and visitors that message that this is someplace important. Perhaps as much as anything else, parks are the Palmer legacy. We're sitting, or the land surrounding this museum is a Palmer deed. One of the first handfuls of acres of land set out in Colorado Springs for parkland is right around us here. His idea for parks was, I think, very forward-thinking, and reflects things that would ultimately end up happening in New York City, which is that open space is important to create a healthy population. You allow people to get outside, to enjoy trails, to walk, to get exercise, to get fresh air, and certainly at the turn of the last century, to recover their health, which became really one of the first industries we had here, was bring people who are suffering from tuberculosis to Colorado Springs so they could get healthy again. In order to do that, you had to have open space and welcoming parks. And Palmer spent tens of thousands of dollars each month in buying and improving land and making sure that people would have close access to parks. He created roads that would allow people to get to those parks. So much of what Palmer did after actually founding the town deals with creating outdoor space. And I think the interesting thing about Colorado Springs is how close we've kept to that vision. Just recently we passed an open space tax to allow us to continue buying open space and improving parkland and providing that for the population. I think that would be one thing that Palmer would feel very comfortable with today in Colorado Springs. So I think wherever you go in the community, you can see either land that Palmer directly influenced, or the result of that vision of a green, comfortable, welcoming community with all of those amenities that I've just talked about.
It had been nearly 25 years since Palmer founded his colony, and Colorado Springs now enjoyed world-class status as a cultured health resort. Ironically, his Queen of Glen Erie continued to reside in England because of her heart condition. By late 1894, with her health deteriorating, she prepared her daughters for the inevitable.
But Elsie realized that she was very, very ill, and so she notified her father that he needed to come. And he did immediately, upon receipt of that letter, book the first passage he possibly could, immediately got on the train and went to New York and got on that first ship. But she did not survive, and he did not make it in time. She died December 28th, and that was 1894. And he was there immediately after, but it was sad that he wasn't with her at the end.
After Queen died in 1894 in England, in December of 1894, the girls came back to Glen Eyrie to live with Palmer. And Elsie really took on the role of hostess at Glen Eyrie until her marriage in 1907. The girls had a fairly rigorous schedule. They entertained guests and visitors at lunch and dinner. They also described afternoons where they would display the family's photo albums and take them around the Glen, take visitors around the Glen, entertaining people who would often spend the night. We have the guest register of Glen Eyrie, and it's like a hotel. There are so many people coming on a daily basis. I have read diary entries where up to 20 people stopped by in a single afternoon and had to be entertained by the daughters. So they would go on walks. They would show people around the castle. They really did their best by their father to entertain as many guests and carry on life at Glen Eyrie, and we know he greatly enjoyed their company.
In 1903 and 04, the general and his daughters decided to turn Glen Eyrie into the castle he had previously envisioned. They expanded the 22-room home to accommodate their ever-increasing guest list, with rooms for entertaining and servants' quarters. The 67-room manor house we see today was fashioned from the stonework, roof tiles, and leaded windows acquired from an abandoned church in Coventry, England. Palmer spared no expense, for he wanted his castle to appear as if it had been in the glen for hundreds of years, and he wanted his daughters to live in the grandeur befitting them long after he was gone.
Every morning, they would take a horseback ride over toward the Garden of the Gods. This was one of the big things for them. The general loved horseback riding, and someone figured out that he may have ridden over 1 million miles on horseback in his lifetime. On one occasion, in 1906, his daughters had a friend of theirs out, and they were going to take their morning ride. And he decided to let this young gal have his horse, and he was going to take another horse called Schoolboy. And as they were coming back through the Garden of the Gods, they had a gate that had to be opened, which he had gone through many times and had opened numerous gates on their riding. As they got close to the gate, he leaned down, as you would have to do, to open the latch. And as he leaned over, the horse stumbled. And because General Palmer was not in a position to pull on the reins to lift the horse's head and help it get its balance, he kept going and fell off the horse and onto his forehead and snapped his neck back and broke several vertebrae and paralyzed himself from about the third rib down for the remainder of his life. And this was a very traumatic experience for this man, that at the end of his life he should have a simple problem with a horse and then lose his health at the same time.
Now a paraplegic, Palmer was forced to depend upon others for his basic needs. He had to be lifted in and out of bed and carried to his wheelchair. Once an active outdoorsman, the general endured a period of anxiety and deep depression, but after several trying months, his self-confidence returned, and he became determined to live out the remainder of his life to its fullest. While he'd never been fond of horseless carriages, they were now the most efficient means to get out and tour his beloved Pikes Peak region. He first bought a noiseless electric car, but its range of travel was limited. He finally settled on a more powerful white steamer, which was capable of climbing the many trails that wove in and around his city.
In the spring of 1907, the general got an invitation to the 45th reunion of his 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry Regiment. He consulted his doctors, and they said, there's no way you are going to travel that far to Philadelphia for a reunion. So he said, okay, I'll invite them out here. And so he sent a wire to the man who was responsible, and I talked to him about it and said, I would like to invite the regiment to my home at Glen Erie in Colorado Springs, and as many men as want to come are welcome, and I will pick up the tab for their entire time, from the time they leave home till the time they get back.
280 of his men responded to this generous invitation. The good general was true to his word and sent a special train to bring the aging veterans to Colorado Springs. Palmer put them up in his luxurious Antlers Hotel with all expenses paid, while the city arranged a grand parade to honor the old soldiers as they marched through the streets with fanfare and applause.
On the culminating night, he invited them out to Glen Erie for a great party, a farewell party, I guess you might want to call it. He had, even though he was a Quaker and he had put a liquor ban in the Colorado Springs property titles where liquor could never be sold in Colorado Springs, he himself enjoyed wines. He had a wine cellar that was above anything else in Colorado, I believe. So he invited the old veterans out to Glen Erie. He had the one room filled to overflowing, I guess, with potent potables, liquor of various types and wines, probably a lot of bourbon because a lot of those old veterans were bourbon drinkers, and I guess it went on into the wee hours of the morning before it finally broke up, and he enjoyed every minute of it, had a great time, they said, even though he was paralyzed and couldn't move around. But it was quite a blowout, one of the biggest parties ever held in this city. The party lasted the day and into the wee hours of the next morning, and I think finally broke up when everyone finished the last drop of liquor.
Seeing his old comrades in arms had lifted his spirits but drained him physically. By the following summer of 1908, he had regained the stamina and will to travel to England to attend his youngest daughter's wedding to a British gentleman. During the ocean crossing, however, Marjorie realized she couldn't go through with the ceremony as she'd fallen in love with Dr. Watt, her father's attending physician. Palmer understood and insisted they continue on to England, where they enjoyed a grand holiday together as a family.
It was on the voyage back that as the assistants and aides were carrying him onto the ship, that whether the ship moved or what happened, somehow they tipped the stretcher that he was on, and his head hit a metal part of the ship, and he was in rather poor condition. Of course, he had his doctor there, but he never really recovered from that. He made the trip home and survived another couple of months, but he never really recovered to his old self, and that was the beginning of the end, basically.
In early November of 1908, Palmer's oldest daughter, Elsie, presented him with a granddaughter, Elsie Queen Myers, but she would be the only grandchild he'd ever see. On March 11, 1909, the general fell into a deep coma and never regained consciousness. He died 2 days later on March 13th in his home at Glen Erie.
Throughout his life, it's estimated that he gave away approximately $5 million, about half of his fortune. When he died, he left about $1 million to each of his daughters. He left various sums to long-term employees, to family friends. He even left $100,000 to the daughter of a local artist. He left a large endowment for Colorado College. And throughout his lifetime, he'd been known to provide pensions for people that had not worked for him for years and years. His payroll for any given month was up to $15,000 a month. He was extremely generous in donating land, in donating sums of money to causes that he believed in.
Go out to his grave in Evergreen Cemetery, and you'll see, I think, a lot about the man, which is, it's a very plain tombstone. It's a granite boulder with his name and dates engraved in it. And I think that tells me a lot more about Palmer than the sculpture does. You know, Palmer was not, I mean, he had an ego. He would not have done what he did in his life in terms of building industries and building towns if he didn't have an ego. So I'm not sure he would absolutely deny the creation of a sculpture. I think he enjoyed, to some extent, his reputation, his legacy. But I think probably the Quaker in him would have been uncomfortable with that, and that's what you're seeing in the tombstone out at Evergreen. So I think there are, you know, the sculpture is an excellent reminder of where we come from and the unique nature of the community. And if Palmer walked back into town today and saw it, I think a part of him would have been proud and a part of him would have been embarrassed. Probably no different than any of us if we had the same honor.